Started tonight. First of all, thank you all for coming. We are honored to be hosting Charly Winter Charly. Thank you all for joining in the conversation this evening. My name is Brooke Seidelman. I'm the Gallery Director here at the Joan Hussein Healing Arts Gallery. And we are a nonprofit art space dedicated to exploring the innate connection between healing and creativity. And that means every 6 weeks we rotate different contemporary artists coming through addressing significant issues that impact our community directly. Now, the reason we're hosting this show and the reason we have the gallery is to provide opportunities and space for artists like Charly who have something important to say it, to engage with the community, and to open up new, sometimes difficult, conversations around healing. And so that's why we're all here this evening, to jump into such conversation. But before we open up that conversation, I want to point out that all the works in the show are available. Well, not all of them, but the ones that are left are for sale. And we also have exhibition catalogs featuring essays by Horace, Myrtis, and Charly, available for $15. So if you're interested in purchasing those, come find me afterwards. Now, sort of to kick off the conversation, I'm going to introduce our curator, Myrtis, who I have personally been privileged to work with and collaborate on this show. So I'm just going to read a little bit about her bio. Myrtis is founding director of Galerie, Myrtis, a contemporary fine art gallery located in Baltimore. She is the recipient of the Foreign Language and Area Studies Fellowship, African Language Institute, Shona Language and Culture from Michigan State University. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Business Administration from the University of Maryland University College, and attended the Exhibition Design Seminar offered through the Maryland Institute College of Art. As cultural liaison for the embassies of Ghana, Haiti, Mali, Republic of Georgia, and Zimbabwe, Myrtis uses art to encourage cultural exchange and awareness. Myrtis is also contributing writer to the International Review of African American Art and online newsletters such as Art Info and International Review of African American Art. She serves on the board of directors here at Smith Center for Healing in the Arts and the Station North Arts and Entertainment District in Baltimore, and is a member of Art Table, a national organization for professional women in the visual arts. She also sits on the Practicum Advisory Committee for the Maryland Institute College of Art and Open Society Institute of Baltimore Leadership Committee, and has served as a grant panelist for the DC Commission for the Arts and Humanities in Washington, DC. So Myrtis will open it up.
Thank you, Brooke, and thank you all for joining us tonight for this important dialogue. I'm going to begin by introducing Charly. Well, we're going to do it conversationally. So, Charly, I would like for you to kind of give us a background, provide us with some background information in terms of your artistic training and then the length of your artistic career.
Thank you. Again, thank you everyone for being here today. My name is Charly Palmer. I was born in Fayette, Alabama, 1960. Most of my siblings were born in Alabama, and then we moved up north to Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1964. I remember a lot about that because it was a cultural shock for me to go from a little small town of 2,000 to a big city. I remember arriving in Chicago, Illinois, and Union Station with the towers, 2-level, 3-level buildings, and how just fascinating that was. But to see the towering those was really intriguing. But grew up, went to school there. After graduating from high school, I went to Chicago, which was only 94 miles away, 2 hours away. At the time, I had an opportunity to I had gotten a scholarship to go to Pratt in New York, but quite frankly, I was too scared. It really is the truth. It's like, I'm not going that far away from my mother. I'm sorry. Let's keep it frank. No, it was really too far away from me. I remember quite frankly, arriving, or my mom and a friend and my dad driving to Chicago, dropping me off, and my friend called me like a couple of weeks later and said, "Look, your mother cried all the way home." I could have said to him, I cried that whole day too. But, educated I originally went to the School of the Art Institute in Chicago, studying fine art. Began to find out real quickly because of the base of the program and everything, that it was going to be really difficult getting a job. I had no scholarships, I was paying a grant. I needed a job. And we were sharing dormitories with Roosevelt University and the American Academy of Art, also in Chicago. What I discovered was one day, I saw, students from the academy dropping out left and right. The academy program was so difficult that these, I mean, like, I saw a grown man one day in tears packing his portfolio, slamming stuff and saying, I'm going home. And at that point, I really, after a year of going to a school where at the time the program was so loose, it was like, be yourself, express yourself, have fun. And all I could think about is I have loans to pay back. I need to learn some skill. And I heard this guy crying in the dorm next to me, and he said he was going. And at that point, I was like, I have to go to the academy and see what's going on there. And I went over to the academy, and they broke it down really quickly into what their program was all about, and I knew it was for me. And so went to the American Academy, where I graduated in 1980, and then after graduating, went into advertising right away. So I spent about 25 years in doing graphic design and illustration. First in Chicago, then back in Milwaukee for several years, and I've been in Atlanta, Georgia now for the last 21 years. In that time, I was always creating art, my personal work, not necessarily showing it, not necessarily selling it, but doing this because this is my escape from the art that I did daily and meeting crazy deadlines and all that. So I had to get beyond that, and that was my escape. But at some point, I decided that I needed to step out on faith and really pursue my love, and that was just to create for myself in the hopes that people could connect to what I was doing. I don't know, is that enough?
Yes, that's
Okay.
great. Yes. So I've known you, or known of your work longer than I personally have known you. And so there's a couple things I would like to ask you surrounding that. You know, many artists, there are many talented artists, and all of whom seek to, you know, distinguish themselves from the pack,
Right.
so to speak. So what is it that you believe you've done to distinguish yourself based on your technique and style?
That's a good question. I think that, I think it was, I don't know if it was Arthur Miller, or I think it was Bill T. Jones, who said that there is no such thing as originality or original. We're all influenced by someone. And those who made comparisons to my work will probably have to make many comparisons because I've been influenced by many different people. I've never consciously copied anyone, but texture or layer or something type using typography, whatever it might be, I kind of took in a little bit of all of that. The desire is always to tell a story, and so I think that my style came from, and I tell artists all the time, learn all you can, but be still and learn and listen to that still voice, and that voice will reveal the direction that you're going in. You know, quite frankly, I think for me, the last couple of years, I've been on autopilot and just kind of creating. This was one of the first series of pieces that came out of like the aha moment, and I think I shared that last time, and I'll share it with you again. It was two things. It was twofold. When I have some long answers, I know. When I first created a piece, Cornel West. Is Cornel West in the show? Mm-hmm. All right. When I first created Cornel West, and I was telling the story of Tar Baby, and the true story of Tar Baby, which has nothing to do with race. A friend of mine was in LA, and he was at an event. He called me up and said, I'm in LA, I need you to send me a copy of that picture you just did. I sent him an email of it, and then a couple of minutes later my phone rings. It's a Friday afternoon, a Friday email in my studio painting. And my friend's on the phone, and he says, hold on a minute. And so I hold, and all of a sudden, on a voice, and immediately I knew it was like, my brother. Yeah. You know, and I'm like, this is Cornel West. And I'm listening, like, this is Cornel West. And I'm like, I'm looking at my friend, he said, what? And I'm like, I can't talk to you right now, this is Cornel West. And I'm listening to him, and he said he got it. He absolutely got where I was coming from, because he had in a presentation earlier that year at Ebenezer Baptist Church, had talked about Tar Baby. He had talked about the whole idea that our president was now in a situation where he'd walked into the Oval Office and realized how much of a mess that the country was in, and this sticky situation that he is now being blamed for that was created prior to him. And so that, in that case, was that tar. And so, but he talked about that, and I'm like, he got it. He understood where I was coming from. And so at that point, because I initially was going to tell the story on the level of what is modern day Brer Rabbit, the whole story and all the different stories of Brer Rabbit. But when Cornel West responded the way he did, I immediately started thinking, maybe that's where I need to go. And then I got an invitation, several invitations from a friend of mine who lives in Baltimore to say, you need to come to Baltimore, you need to come to Baltimore, you need to come hang out in Baltimore. And I'm like, there's nothing in Baltimore. I'm sorry, there is something in Baltimore. I'm like, there's nothing in Baltimore. He said, you gotta come. And we came, and I was hanging out with him, and he said, you know, there's a couple I need you to meet. And I'll see if they're available. It happened to be Myrtis and Alex. And we came over, and we got to talking. Literally, we're sitting in the kitchen, and we're talking, and she had asked me, what have you been up to lately? And I'm like, well, I've been thinking about doing a series called Tar Baby. And immediately, both of you kind of responded in a way, I'm like, okay, they're getting it. They really understand where it's coming from. And then immediately, I went home and started, and you said, I want to do a show. Whenever it's done, let's do a show. And that's where it all kind of began, you know.
All right, I'm going to stop you there because I have another question for you as it relates to that. Knowing sort of and understanding the history of the work, you've done series around the civil rights movements and other social political issues. Do you have a propensity for trouble? I mean, you know, these bodies of works really upset people. So, do you have a propensity for controversial subject matter? What's wrong with you?
You know, it's funny because I don't see anything, honestly, I see nothing offensive about what I've done. In fact, what I've always done is I'm hoping to encourage a conversation. I'm hoping to encourage dialogue. I want people to sit down and talk about this stuff. And why I continued to paint when I was doing a lot of the work related to the civil rights movement is that you encounter young people all the time that have no clue. And then their parents are even telling them, and their grandparents, some of them almost experience something where they, like after the war, post-traumatic kind of, they don't want to talk about it. Some of them were civil rights, you know, freedom fighters who've had, you know, billy clubs against their head and they never told their children. I encountered in my journey of creating this work, people that were truly traumatized by it, but their children had no idea. Like I was in Richmond, Virginia, ironically, that's where it's from. And I met a sister who's now in her late 60s who helped to integrate the schools there. And her children didn't even know. And the only reason they found out is PBS found her and interviewed her and did a program on her. And they're like, how come you never told that story? And so every time I thought about going away from that story, it's like it's so relevant to today. You know, so relevant to, you know, this whole concept, this whole idea that we have overcome. You know, we're making progress. And I think it was, I don't know if it was John Lewis at the MLK unveiling, or someone else who said only one of the small steps to the justice and the struggle, because the struggle continues. And you can see from the politics and the news and everything that the struggle does continue. And so I'm very often exploring other things, but I'll always come back because this is home. The story, you know, I'll sit down, I mean, I encounter people and they'll tell me a story about their aunt or their uncle, and I know there's a painting there. And so that story will be something I'll always tell. But I really quite honestly, maybe I'm naive, but I don't see anything real controversial about anything that's in here.
Well, we'll get to that later. So Horace, you and I had the pleasure of meeting at the David Driscoll Center. You served as one of the curators for the exhibition Embodied, Black Identities in American Art from the Yale University Art Gallery. And you sat on a panel, and I have to tell you, I was literally blown away listening to this gentleman speak. And so I was excited to go up to talk with him later. And I was in the midst of, you know, planning and Charly's exhibition, and knew that this exhibition and this body of work warranted a catalog. And then we stumble upon this genius, and I go up to him and I say, would you consider, I asked two questions. The first was, you know, do you know Charly Palmer? And you said yes, that you were familiar with his work. And I thought, oh, I can rope him in now. And then the second thing I did was share with you the concept for this exhibition. And then I threw the question out, would you write an essay? And he did not hesitate. He said yes. And I was like mesmerized. I couldn't believe it. I think I asked him like 2 or 3 times to make sure he could actually commit it without having seen any of the work. But I just knew that he would have the ability to contextualize the work. And if you haven't read the essay, you really, really must. So you are a PhD candidate in American Civilization at Brown University. So how does this intersect with art?
So when I started my undergraduate education, I always thought that I was going to do musical theater. And I wanted to be on Broadway, I wanted to be in all the big plays. I wanted to do it by the time I was 25. Paul Robeson was my hero. And I thought that was my life. And then I actually had the opportunity one spring break to stay with a couple of friends in New York who were trying out that life. and I realized that I was not cut out for that. So I liked my creature comforts a little too much. So then I started kind of thinking about, as Charly had just talked so eloquently, listening to that little voice inside, and thinking about who are the people in my life that I most respected, that I most learned from, that I was most interested in everything that they had to say, and the way that they lived their lives, and the types of spiritual and cultural practices that they embodied. And they were my teachers. I had extraordinary teachers in grade school, extraordinary teachers in my church, extraordinary dance teachers, theater teachers, music teachers, coaches. And so I decided to be a teacher. And I had the great opportunity in my senior year of college to study abroad at Oxford. I majored in British literature, and I was really interested in the Romantic poets. And I had this wonderful teacher who made me read Keats for an entire semester. And in the process of that, I realized that so many of the great odes that Keats wrote, he was always contemplating another work of art. So he was always thinking about ideas of ekphrasis or mimesis, one art form, parodying, taking wonderful kind of themes, forms from another art form and turning them into something else. And he was thinking particularly about the Elgin marbles that had come to London at that time. So then I became really fascinated in the relationship between literature and the visual arts, literature and sculpture, literature and paint. And then I started thinking more and more, and I started looking for jobs, and it seemed complete blessing, right? That the only jobs I could find were jobs in the education department and art museums. So my first job was in the education department at Monticello, working with Lenny Sout, who's working on the big slavery project and narrative and documenting every single slave that Thomas Jefferson and his wife held, over 600 people. And of course, Lenny is now on the board of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And so I was able to be her intern on that and giving tours. And then I got a job at the University of Virginia Art Museum, the Yale Art Gallery, and the RISD Art Museum, where I am now. And so I was always fascinated by the ways in which art moves as a cultural production, and the ways that for people like me who are interested in so many things, the contemplation of a work of art in all of its forms, however we define art, is really this wonderful conversation between the artist and the viewer, always changing, always dynamic. You always bring something new to a work of art because we change every moment of our lives. And so when I saw Charly's images for the first time, I just started jumping up and down in complete excitement. And so I was very honored that you asked me.
Thank you. So let's talk about the story. The encounter between Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox and the Tar Baby. And the Tar Baby has become a metaphor for many things in this series. But for those who are not familiar with the story and the origin of it, let's discuss that first.
Well, the history of Brer Rabbit comes from Africa. And so if you go to any country, any continent where there are Africans, they may go by different names, but Brer Rabbit, Brother Rabbit is really where also, but also if you go to Jamaica, even if you go to parts of Cuba, anywhere, they'll know that story or know variations of that story. And so, being that I love the story was a very simple, classic story about, and I've been exploring the whole idea of the conversation. What is the rabbit saying to Tar Baby? But it was set up by, for those who don't know, Rare Fox got a doll, immersed it in tar, and set it on the road where he knew Brer Rabbit would encounter it. And in the encounter, he knew that he would try to engage it. He knew the more likely he would get upset with it, and that's what happened. He was trying to have a conversation with someone who was not responding to him. He got upset, began to try to attack the doll, not knowing it was a doll, and got stuck in the tar. A lot of times people don't know the rest of the story. The rest of the story became where once he was stuck in the tar, Brer Fox pops out and says, finally, he's been outwitted. You know, I think also, and I don't ever really address this, this story has so much to do with a story that was once ours, the African, that became someone else's. Even the whole idea of Bugs Bunny was derived from Brer Rabbit. Tortoise and the Hare, Brer Rabbit. All these, these characters that have come, like, it was interesting to see what Disney did with Brer Rabbit, making him more of a cartoon character and everything. But this was originally our story. It was passed orally for 400 years before it was ever documented. And when it was first documented, it was documented by Roosevelt, President Roosevelt's uncle. And he had submitted these stories that he had overheard through former slaves. And he submitted it to Harper, and Harper bought the two, and that was the end of it for him. But later down the road was Chandler. And Chandler out of Georgia, actually out of Monroe, Georgia, same thing. He had heard some of these stories, and his original twist was that he added Uncle Remus. Uncle Remus became the storyteller, but the stories themselves were not the original stories written by this man, but taken from somewhere else, and then written down, documented, and that's how he became a famous writer or author. And so that's the other part of the story. It's like how often something has originated here or originated by the African, even when it comes to original music that has come from our country and how it's become taken and altered and claimed by someone else is the other part of the story. And so when it comes to that, it really becomes this humorous story and really asking the question, again, Tar Baby, what is your Tar Baby? What has been that situation that we've all found, some more difficult than others, that has literally altered your life? It has changed your life. It has ended your career. One of my favorite pieces, quite honestly, in this show is the Pee Wee Herman piece, which you look at it, it's calling out something really honestly, who is not guilty of this? And if anyway, but it's honestly, I love Pee Wee Herman. I thought it was a genius when it came to comedy. And Paul Reubens' career almost ended because he did something that, quite frankly, I thought was so unnatural. And so that is kind of the question that I asked. The Brer Rabbit story initially had nothing to do with the color of someone's skin. It had to do with a tricking, a cunning, a sneaky rabbit.
So the meeting, the encounter between Brer Rabbit and the Tar Baby is depicted in the meeting,
right,
in your series, which is on page 11 if you have a catalog. So we're going to use the catalog because I don't have a PowerPoint presentation to kind of guide you through the paintings that Charly is going to be referring to as we go along. So referring to your essay, and I'm going to draw from Horace's essay as we go through, you state that the Tar Baby series is controversial, heady, universal, academic. The series is unlike an exploration of heroic portraiture undertaken in recent years. The series revels in the pleasantries of things polite Negroes do not say. Why is that? What is it that we Negroes don't want to talk about?
That's lovely.
You said it.
No, your question was lovely. My word. If I could refer, I think, again, to another image, it's the image of Dr. Gates, And so as I was crafting this essay, being in Providence, Rhode Island, 30 minutes from Boston, this idea of Dr. Gates, or Skip Gates, as he is known, breaking into his own home after sabbatical in China was incredibly terrifying for men of color in that part of the country for a few weeks. And so I was thinking about what are the ideas around Rare Rabbit, around these moments that we all deal with, these sticky situations that everyone, no matter who we are, regardless of race, ethnicity, religious affiliation, sexuality, socioeconomic class, the things that we all deal with from our first moment of sentience up until we are 200 years old, right? And what are the ways in which human bodies are constantly confronting the world they live in and are forced to make choices about their lives. Out of that, and out of kind of thinking about those questions, came these ideas that I thought, polite Negroes don't talk about it. The idea of Skip Gates breaking into his own house, I think one can talk about in relation to Rare Rabbit. Of course, we know Professor Gates' seminal essay, The Signifying Monkey, in which he's talking about this is where African American language and rhetoric comes from. This is the birth of culture. These stories that start in Africa are transmutated through the Middle Passage, through anywhere from 200 to 400 years of enslavement and working and bondage, and then have kind of started to fuel our own cultural productions. And I was like, but there are ways that we don't talk about it, right? We don't talk about the role necessarily of gender in those stories. We don't necessarily talk about the ways in which the African American community has always been divided around religion. We're not all Baptists, we're not all Methodists, right? If one thinks about African Americans in the Deep South for many years, it's one of the largest Catholic populations ongoing for over the past 500 years in America. When we think about African American culture, we have to take in Catholicism, right? We have to think about the ways in which images and the way that we read and the way that we worship and the way that we understand ourselves have always been engaged. We don't talk about issues around sexuality in that struggle of 400 years. We might talk about kind of this is where the kind of division of black men and black women and black love comes from, and the ways in which work divided black men from black women. But we don't necessarily talk about same gender desire in those stories, right? We don't necessarily talk about in public, when we're not amongst ourselves, issues of racism that exist within the black community around colorism. We don't necessarily talk about neoliberalism and neoconservatism in certain ways. And so there were so many ways in which I felt that Charly's work spoke to all of these issues in one way or another, that in confronting the canvases and the works on paper, we were forced to also confront ourselves and the stories that were in our own histories and past of our own bodies that we necessarily didn't tell, the stories that might have been in our family memories that we necessarily have always wanted to know. And if I can just very quickly tell a story that I had, I was talking to my dad about Andy Warhol, 1964, kind of took these series of photographs from Life magazine about the Birmingham riots, quote unquote, although no black folks were rioting, right? And kind of took some of the ones that he thought were incredibly seminal and then blew them up to 5 times their size and screen printed them on canvases, right? And some of them are completely whitewashed so that it's just black bodies on white canvas and white paint, almost looking like a huge newsprint. Or he blued them, or he made them red. This is during the same period of time that he's also making his electric chair series. And I was talking to my father about this photograph, and my father told me a story that I never knew, how the KKK came to my grandfather's family, and that's why my grandfather, who is 8, was an orphan in rural North Carolina, and his older brothers left in the dead of night to go to Philadelphia, and why I did not know that part. these stories, and I was sitting there going, Dad, all the time that I have gone down to Gates County, North Carolina, 5, 6, 7, 8 times a year since I was born, and I'm just hearing that story now at 27. You know, and he was like, you don't talk about those things, you know? And the thing that Charly's work inspires is that these stories for all these canvases are not just about race, although race for some of these individuals is the tar baby, but it's thinking about what is the collective unconscious of America not saying at this moment? How are the ways in which the kind of political rhetoric around Obama being a Muslim is actually political rhetoric around Obama being a man of color, however we want to define that, right? And so I was really interested in that when I was writing that.
Awesome. So you sort of answered my next question, but I'll throw it out, and so we can start really getting into the work itself. And so the question is, how does a fable, as an innocent childhood story, become a metaphor for grappling with such serious issues as bigotry, racism, and stereotyping? And then in examining the convictions of the famed and the infamous as individuals that you've selected for this body of work, and as suggested by Horace, these individuals who white America has ripped to shreds and black America has beheaded. So I want to go into, you talked about the Cornell West piece, so unless there's something, more that you'd like to say about that, we can go on to the next. And I want to pick up on the Obama piece, which is page 13 in the catalog, because he really epitomizes one who has not one but many tar babies, because again, the tar baby is not the individual that's depicted in the work, with the exception of the tar baby behind you. But it is those idioms, they serve as the idiom, and the metaphor is the tar baby for those things that they have become entangled by, their convictions or a situation or a belief. So let's talk a little bit about what you believe and what you believe are some of Obama's tar babies and those of some of the others that I'd like to touch upon. So let's start with the president.
I mean, when I addressed initially, there's a whole idea that I'm sure it was something that he dreamed of, the better part of his life, to some degree understanding what it came with as far as that responsibility of being the president, but little did any of us know what state that we were in. And so literally, it almost is like walking into the Oval Office and saying, you're almost stepping into the tar. And so it literally is like in your face. It's like one of the things that happened with that piece is that, and many people have commented on that, it's like, look how great a president has gotten in a short amount of time. It's the stress of the responsibility. And so I'm really kind of looking at, like, if you look at that piece, it's the little tar baby sitting on his shoulder, and times you want to ask yourself, like, in the case of that, with many of these, it's not a race issue. It becomes a race issue. It often becomes, because in America, often everything becomes a race issue. But when you think about race, and like someone said, in one email that we addressed, it said that Martin Luther King, Martin Luther King, President Obama, and Hitler had nothing in common. It's a bold statement, but I think it's completely wrong.
Oh, it's erroneous.
But I'm looking at, like, and one of the things, and this is not related to Martin Luther King or President Obama, but it is related to Hitler. If you read the history of Hitler and you hear his story, he was a failed artist. That was fascinating to me. But what was even more interesting is that the definition of the Aryan race fit him in no way. Athletic, tall, regal, fair skin, blue eyes, blonde hair. And it's like, that's nothing that you are. So are you saying you hate yourself? Because his description, Hitler looked more Jewish, didn't look like anything else. And so it becomes like, what is your tar? Sometimes that tar is self-hatred. And it's like really examining, do you love yourself? And if not, why? And like, I'm not my hair or the hair thing. It's like, women get caught up sometimes in their hair. And like, this is what God gave you. Nappy it up or perm it or whatever you want to, but live with it and be happy with it. And so I think that, going away from that, like the Hitler piece is one of those, it's like, look at it. I mean, I'm fascinated by history, and always was, and I was always interested in his story, but it's like no one seemed to ever really address the idea of look at him and look at what was defined as the perfect Aryan nation, and it did not fit him at all.
Well, for some, when Obama became president, going back to the president's piece, the belief was that we suddenly become this post-racial society, that we've embraced the idea that there's equality, that there are no racial problems, they no longer exist in our society. But how would you respond to that, given our president's reign thus far?
I would say we're in a post-racial society if one is a person of color of a specific socioeconomic class. And I think that means that class has always been tied to race in America, and class and race have always been tied to gender in America. And I think that, for me, when I was thinking about that election, I was thinking, Obama, yes, this is wonderful, but wouldn't it be nice to have someone who did not go to an Ivy League school in the race? Wouldn't it be nice to have someone who is not a lawyer in the running? Wouldn't it be nice to have someone who literally was an American over the age of 35 who had spoken to enough people, traveled the country, worked Main Street, as they like to call it, and Americans built him or her up to be the running mate? Wouldn't that be something? And I think that the power of the Obama piece here is that this Obama piece comes out of the moment, and it's a question I've actually always wanted to ask you, Charly, is that I think so many of us remember the caricatures of George W. Bush with the big ears and kind of the square head and the very elongated kind of heart-shaped face. And I look at that Obama piece and I think about, I see this wonderful composite image of George W. Bush and Obama in one. And for me, I think you're exactly right, Myrtis. I remember sitting in my dorm room in New Haven and seeing Oprah Winfrey, Jesse Jackson, Reverend Al Sharpton, hundreds of thousands of people in Millennium Park in Chicago, tears in their eyes, right? Seeing Michelle, Sasha, Malia come out. Those were actually my real heroes. I was like, black women in the White House, yeah! But and seeing Obama waving, and I could see, I was like, this is something, and it is something.
Yes.
It will always be something. It will always be one of those moments that I think Americans now in the future will look back on and say, at this moment, in these hours, we were our best selves, right? But there was always a sense, I think, when one looked at all the people who were running in the race, when one looked at all of the rhetoric, when the papers were done and cleared, Obama was not the most liberal or progressive candidate running. He was not the most liberal or progressive candidate even seeking the nomination. There are ways in which one could look at Hillary Rodham Clinton and Bill Clinton and see what they did for historically black colleges and universities that very few people knew about during their time in the White House that Obama never touched upon. It took Hillary Rodham Clinton telling him for him to confront the role of women in the world or the role of HIV/AIDS in our own communities and not elsewhere. So I think that there was a way in which he gave us an icon, an image that couldn't help but step in the tar when he walked into the Oval Office. Anyone would have. But I think that there was a way in which our hopes couldn't help but to be let down when he stepped in there and realized the very nature of the job, of any job, that you are interviewed with one set of credentials and one set of expectations, and when you actually sit down at that desk in that seat, there are a whole list of other people you have to think about and talk to and deal with. And so that piece to me is so interesting to think about. The tar baby is just what the job is, the nature of the beast,
So let's try to go through some of the others. We don't have time to do each, but I've selected some which I believe are not controversial, but more interesting. I won't use the word controversial. So the title of the Abraham Lincoln piece is No Hero to Me. It's on page 12. So, you know, he is a hero to me, but why not to Charly Palmer?
And you know, if you notice that the biography and autobiography, or I don't think it was autobiography, so it's a biography of Lincoln, and anything written of Lincoln became very popular after the election or prior to the election because he was a hero of President Obama. He spoke of him often. But in knowing history and understanding what Abraham Lincoln's position was on the African and the African American and slaves at the time, it was one of those where, for many reasons other than the idea of what was right, was why he freed the African. And like many don't know, I think it was the state of Missouri, he didn't, because it was part of the North. And so it was economics was one of the reasons. But in some of the readings you will find that Abraham Lincoln also felt that when it came to soldiers, that he didn't think that black men, Africans, were brave enough or strong enough, smart enough to be soldiers. And so when you really start to, he also believed in a separate nation. He believed in separating, freeing the African or the African American and putting them in their own area, maybe if the states are on an island. And so all these things, he didn't think that black or the African American and whites could coexist. And so for many different reasons, he simply was never a hero of mine.
And I think for many, we don't know that about Lincoln. He freed us, and we're forever grateful, but we don't know that behind that was the thought that we were not equal citizens, we were not intelligent. And so that piece is another one in which is very profound to me, and I think when people read the title of it, they may be taken aback by it. But in doing so, just as the person who responded in the email that you mentioned, someone was very upset about the title and the use of the term tar baby, which we're going to get into. We're not going to leave here without talking about that. But I wanted to know if you had any comments about the Abraham Lincoln piece.
I did two things. When I thought about the Abraham Lincoln piece, I also thought about kind of what Lincoln stood for and kind of all the other quote-unquote white male liberation figures that could be Lincoln's. And I would just keep thinking about my grandmother's house where she had the plate of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and RFK and JFK right there. You know, it's like those four just kind of in a row. And I remember, you know, with my 9th grade self going up to my 70-year-old grandmother and saying, did you know, blah, 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 but thinking about, you know, 1964 Civil Rights Act, but thinking about how JFK did not want to sign that act, you know, and Malcolm X couldn't make him sign that out, Martin Luther King couldn't make him sign that out, his brother RFK couldn't make him sign that act, and it was actually Lyndon Johnson who then signed that act, right? But it's in thinking about the ways in which we give people power and authority when they really, truly did not necessarily have golden images of humanity, brotherhood, equality in hand. That is often political, is often economic, right? And I think that your idea of Lincoln is so powerful, right? He freed the slaves in the states that were in rebellion, right? So one could argue that those states didn't have to listen, and they didn't. But when slaves heard about it, they knew that if they crossed into territories or northern states, they would not be sent back, right? That's what it did. It didn't free them. It just meant that if you cross into territories or states that are, quote unquote, in the north are not yet states, but are protectorates, you will not be sent back to your masters. And I think that that was so powerful in that piece. It's also the one where the tar baby is looking at Lincoln, and we only see the back of the tar baby's head. And so in some ways, we're able to place ourselves as that tar baby sitting on the ground, looking at Lincoln, looking up the Lincoln Memorial and saying, what is my relationship to you?
So let's talk about Dave Chappelle and self-preservation. Page 24. And the title of that piece is That Is Why Africa. And tell us why that piece was so important for you.
I don't know if anyone's familiar with the program, The Actors Studio, with James Lipton. But that interview with Dave Chappelle was first, I think James Lipton has only did 2-hour interviews twice. Robin Williams, because he kept getting out of control. As he gets to talking, it's like, you know what, we can't do this in an hour. And Dave Chappelle, because he said at the end of that interview, this is one of the most fascinating and intriguing interviews I've ever had. But Dave Chappelle, really honestly, an intelligent man, an intelligent awareness of himself, talks about the choice to walk away from the show that offered him $30 million a season. And it was because they asked him to compromise too much. And he, they began to tell him what comedy was. And he made it very clear in his position what he was attempting to do with his show. And when they said more money, it meant more control on their end. And he chose because of integrity, which most of us, I had to ask myself that, would I walk away from, no, I'm sorry, I wouldn't. I wouldn't walk away from $30 million. They say, if you want me to wear blackface, maybe I will. I don't know. And they're like, $30 million, I can justify that. I want help, I want to donate money to the black community, or whatever it's going to be. But I'm like, I really, really admire this man for what he did. I think he's a happier person for it. But even the black community, when it came to his choice, the rumor immediately became Dave Chappelle has lost his mind. Because he chose to walk away from a lot of money, but what they asked him to do in exchange for it was not worth it. And so that's where it came from. It came from this idea that his Tar Baby was his show. And when it was put in the way it was presented to him, he chose, I'm going to Africa. I'm going away from all this for a while because I would refuse to do what they asked me to do. And so I truly admire him for that decision.
Do you have any comments on Chappelle's position?
I think Charly said it as eloquently as anyone could say it, right? Absolutely. And that being, and correct me if I'm wrong, one of the first of many, not the first, but one of the first pieces that really kind of galvanized and seemed, at least in my mind, to crystallize the series, where it becomes really clear that there's this moment and we have to decide, right? It's incredibly piece.
So
let me say, if you get a chance, YouTube his interviews, because he'll explain to you that his dad told him, what are you willing to compromise? And he breaks it down in such an amazing way. And he points to Hollywood and says, look what Hollywood has done to black comedians. It's just the man is brilliant in his insight. His comedy was brilliant. It was brilliant. Hilarious. He laughed at I don't know if you've ever seen the skit he did of the black racists, the Klan. It was brilliant. A blind black man who didn't know he was black, right? And he tells the story. Where did that skit derive from? It derived from a fair-skinned grandfather who literally was so light that he could pass for a for a white man. And during the time of the riots, his grandfather, who was blind again, was on a bus when the riots broke out. And immediately, some brothers were about to attack him when he said, no, I'm black. And it was that kind of, he said, and from that came this brilliant skit. It's so funny. YouTube it, it's so funny. And it's so, but when you hear, that's the other thing about the mix that's so brilliant. If you hear what's coming out of this man's mouth from a black person, you begin to realize just how ridiculous it sounds for anyone to say this. So take a look at it sometime. The man he was incredible, so he truly inspired me. It was definitely one of those aha moments where it's like, he's perfect. He's perfect for what I'm trying to say.
So let's look at some of the women for a moment. And let's start with Angela Davis, the revolutionary, which is on page 20. She was a fugitive. She protested against the government. Of course, we know that she was a pivotal figure in the Black Panther movement. And I've just been taken aback by a group of students when the exhibition was in Galerie Myrtis in Baltimore. There were several school groups that came through, one of which was a group from University of Baltimore. And so there were two young women standing in front of this piece, really admiring it. And there are many iconic figures from the African American culture, our history. So I see these two young women standing in front of it, and they've got this dialogue going back and forth, and I'm like, oh, right, you know, because Angela's one of my heroes. And so I walk up, you know, prepared to engage them in conversation about who she was and the important role she played. And so I asked them, and they burst my bubble because they did not know who she was. They did not know who she was. They were admiring her Africa. So, you know, it's sad. It's really sad because women like her, men who are also depicted like Paul Robeson, Jack Johnson, and others, are not finding their way into our history books, are not being studied by our children. And so that is another reason why these historic figures are so important and their story is so important. And the understanding of what their tar babies are, because that really defines why they're in this exhibition. So let's talk a little bit about Angela.
I think she's brilliant, intelligent. She took a stance, and it was something that she was willing to die for, willing to fight for, willing to live for. And to this day, she's respected for what she did then and what she's doing now. But and she did have a great afro. You know, but what people don't know, a lot of people haven't commented or realized, if you look at Angela Davis's hair, there's Fannie Lou Hamer.
Yes, talk about
And so fewer people know who Fannie Lou Hamer is. And so, and she, again, fighting in the South, being in the heart of Mississippi when it was people, black folk were dying daily. And her struggle when she went through being tortured in prison, in jail, not even prison, but in a county jail. And her fight, and how it wore her down, but how she was such, again, a fighter. And it was really, that piece is a tribute to the women who fought for our rights, who stood up, who were bold, who were intelligent, and who would not back down. And so I'm telling a story within a story.
For me, when I looked at this piece, I think about the huge crush that my dad had on it. Right? And I'm also thinking about her letters of correspondence between George L. Jackson when George L. Jackson is in jail, and the huge crush George L. Jackson had on Angela Davis, right? And thinking about, for me, Angela Davis knows literature, right? An incredible reader of literature, Russian literature, Dostoevsky, Chekhov. One of the first people that I ever read to include Sylvia Plath and Virginia Woolf in a speech, and talking about why she is so interested in Marxist feminism, right? And how her dialogues with socialism and communism come out of a long tradition of women fighting. Not just second wave, not third wave, not black womanism, but first wave feminism in the turn of the century, early 20th, you know. And so I love this piece because it shows us a side of Angela Davis that I think she would openly express that is there, but we don't always get to see, particularly in her kind of iconography. And that's her sensitive side, that's her thoughtful side, that's her pondering side. Angela Davis is one of these individuals who chooses her words very carefully and would prefer to have a pause than a long sentence. And so for me, this shows Angela Davis at a moment of listening, at a moment of her eyes connecting with the viewer, and her really seeing the person in front of her, listening, pondering. And that was what for me was so inspiring about this work, and not her in front of a microphone.
I think when you say that, what I also think about as you're describing it is Shirley Chisholm. You know, almost the same kind of thing. And she, I think, said in a quote once, you know, when people asked which was more difficult, being black or being a woman, she said being a woman. And like that in itself is a heavy thing for a man to think about. But as you're describing, like, you know, it would have been really cool to have actually had her as a part of that piece. You know, because it is very much a tribute to black women.
Let's talk about Myrtis, who's one of my favorites. You know, she's a lyricist who found a way to use rhythm to lure us in with her sultry voice and then tell us about ourselves through one of my favorites, which is Mississippi Goddamn. So, why Nina? I know and I feel a sense of why you chose her, but I would like to hear you say.
I thought Nina Simone was a great storyteller and a great musician who never got her true recognition here in her lifetime. My favorite, I love Four Women. Four Women is one of my favorite songs. What was odd about it as a child growing up, most of the songs I loved of Nina Simone, I didn't know it was a woman singing them. You know, I didn't know until I was in my 20s and I hear some of these songs again. I'm like, oh, a woman did that song. And it was like Nina Simone. It was several songs that, you know, because of that deep voice and everything. But I don't know, it moved me from a young child, Four Women, because this is all about storytelling. And that story, that song tells a powerful and beautiful story, you know. And so it's really about that. It's the whole idea that her talent, this gifted talent, was never really truly acknowledged as it should have been. And so that's what I'm really paying tribute to more than anything, is that, you know, y'all slept on her. You really did. Amazing, gifted lyricist, pianist, her own style and everything like that. And it's like, and I think that like many, like if you talk about Josephine Baker, which is one of them that's repeated a couple of times around here, is that you almost have to go somewhere else, leave your country to really be acknowledged for what gift you truly have to really contribute to the world. And so, you know, I think I said this is like not, I want to recognize it for her for what she was, which was just amazing on so many different levels.
When we first met, Myrtis, I just finished divinity school, and when I was thinking about Nina Simone, I was thinking about this quote, one of my favorite lines that the Gospels told us that Jesus says, "You are a prophet everywhere but your own home." Right? That the people that you grew up with are always just like, carpenter's son, you're reading Hebrew, you're reading Latin, what do you mean? No, you can't do this, you know? And he was like, that's when he told disciples, shake the dust from your feet, keep on walking, right? And I think about someone like Nina Simone, similar to a Shaka Khan, similar to a James Baldwin, who had to leave the US and go to Paris or go to Eastern Europe to find space to be themselves, to find space to be the artists that they wanted to do, to tell the stories they wanted to tell. My favorite Nina Simone is Cinnamon. And I agree with both of you completely. She has this power that transcends gender, transcends race, just a phenomenal storyteller, right? Phenomenal storyteller. And when we think about kind of griots and shamans and teachers in our community, there are ways in which Nina Simone, for me in this series, represents musicians, from her all the way to Mos Def, right? And think about the ways in which culture and stories move through music.
So beyond the iconic figures, you also address social issues. So let's look at Black churches through church lives, teenage mothers, and we eat watermelon. Okay. Well, we love watermelon.
We love watermelon.
So let's start with we love watermelon. And I chose this one because I was recently in the company of Black people who told me that they do not eat watermelon in the company of white people because of the stereotype associated with it. And it's a serious issue in our community because we do a lot to assimilate, to be accepted. We do our code shifting and our shape shifting. You know, there's a psychosis that we have to deal with. I mean, who are we really? And so this piece, which, you know, is often looked at with sometimes disdain because of, you know, you have this big piece of work, the little girl with the little braids, you know, you just touch on it all.
Right.
So, you know, there's a lot of taboos in that piece.
Right. But I think the fascinating thing about an image like that, there's nothing about that image that was not already there. You know, even the children trying to share the watermelon. It was taken from the photographs that I found in the book. But it was amazing to go through my research and find all these images of us and our watermelon. And what I'm addressing more than anything is like, forget about the stereotype of loving watermelon. I love watermelon personally.
So do I.
And
I'll eat it in the company of anyone.
I love watermelon. You know, I'm not gonna do a dance as I'm eating it. But, you know, it's like I love it. But it's the reality. It's like what you're saying, that shape shifting, that whole awareness. Like the thought has never crossed my mind. You know, like if I had a piece of watermelon, like okay, who's around before I bite into this? It's never crossed my mind because I'm not concerned about what anyone else thinks about like anything that I'm really creating. It's a whole idea. There's a story to be told, and what you take from it is what you take from it. And I believe, and my desire has always been to get a reaction. And so if you look at the work and you connect with it, great. If you hate it, I think I've also done my job because I am looking for a reaction, a response. And so in that piece, definitely looking for a reaction, definitely looking for a response. And it may be just, I get it, I understand, it's a parody, it's in your face. And that's exactly what my intent is, in your face.
When I first saw an image of this piece, I was thinking about stories from my mother's side of the family, about when she was a little girl going out to pick tobacco. And first the men wouldn't let her and her sisters pick tobacco because my grandmother would dress them in their lace stockings and their pinafores, and they would go out and they would be like, oh, you're too pretty to pick tobacco, which was really what my mom wanted to do because she wanted to go to singing lessons instead. But she would tell these great stories about how my uncles, her older brothers, were not allowed to stop every 30 minutes to an hour to get water, right? So the watermelon that they carried in little plastic bags or oilcloth in their sacks was not only nourishment, but water for them as they were working, right? So thinking about, there are, just as we were saying, idioms, the coded relationship that people's bodies have to the material world. Food being one of them, and particularly for those of us who have people who labored, either in the knowledge of labor, either in our own bodies or in the bodies and members of our communities and families. Food is important, you know, not just to eat, but for sustenance. And so that image to me has always been kind of one of repose. I feel heat, that yellow around the body makes me think of hot sun, heat, enjoyment, a moment of a break, you know? And also the little girl's hands that are both offered in a I want, but also a gift as well. And I completely agree with both of you. These ideas about how we perform our own personal sense of enjoyment and how we take on prejudices without necessarily even knowing that we're taking them on and holding them. I thought it was really poignant in this piece.
Well, because of time, I want to now go into the tar baby, the term, and it having become racialized. And I want to draw from a statement you made in your essay, which reads, Palmer pushes against a racialized interpretation of tar baby, though he remains conscious of the way in which the phrase has been conscripted into an American epithet. So, just briefly, take us to, I wanted you to contextualize the tar, and then maybe that will help us to understand why, in part, it has become this racial epithet. You touch on going back to your reference of the slave ship and the industrialized nation that we now have.
Of course. One of the great things about working with Myrtis and Charly was I got to have a wonderful conversation with Charly almost about 18 months now, in which we talked a lot about the ideas around the work, and we were both really fascinated with this idea of tar. That tar was this substance that is present even as early in American literature and American syntax since Herman Moby Dick, right? Tar is smeared on the hull of the ship, and that allows it to be sealed as a sealant to make the transatlantic voyage, to make the Middle Passage, to make that triangulated route, whether it's trade in human bodies, whether it's trade in cloth, whether it's trade in oil, whether it's trade in whale fat. Right? So tar is a product of modernity, and it's a product of naval shipbuilding. Tar is used in the making of shingles. It's used in the making of rubber tires. It's used in the making of siding. Jackson Pollock, Rothko used a tar-based paint in many of their canvases after World War II. Tar is prevalent even in materials and in visual culture in ways we don't even know. So when one thinks about tar historically, and then thinks about it in relation to this idea of the tar baby, even thinking about Toni Morrison's novel, Tar Baby, and issues of race, and the stickiness of trying to negotiate the real from the imagined, the stickiness of trying to negotiate the ideas that we hold on to that are real to us because they are internalized, and the ones we actually find in the world itself. That tar, because it's viscous, because it's black, because it bubbles, because it has this way of being slightly amorphous, so it's more solid at one point, more liquid at other points, really talks about the way that race shifts in our culture. And I'm particularly thinking about the period from the 1930s up until the 1980s, and even today, right, when terms of African American, colored, Negro, black were being used, some ways simultaneously and interchangeably, some ways had very coded political references, very coded geographical references, but the ways in which tar shifts are also thinking about the ways in which race shifts. That blackness has not always been the way we would define it today, nor has it stayed, thankfully, right, the one drop law as well. So things have shifted over time.
So has it become this racial epithet as a consequence of the margining of white culture in America?
I think that tar, in many ways, at least in thinking about the way I was reading it, is associated with bodies doing work and specific types of work, and the work that builds civilizations, the work that allows a country like America to come to the forefront of the world stage in the early 20th century is through all the ways in which, through trade and commercialism and transportation, tar is there, it's present. And so for me it's become this racial epithet because in thinking back to the Obama candidacy and then presidency and this dialogue and rhetoric around are we in a post-black moment, and thinking about even that question still references race, right? And it still says, what is yet to come? What are we really looking at? What are we truly really asking? And for me, the idea of socioeconomic class, and kind of going back to what I said earlier, for me, socioeconomic class, gender, race are all wrapped up in American culture around each other. So even asking post-black, what are we not asking? Are we in a post-gendered society? No. Are we in a post-class society? No. So could we ever be in a post-black, post-whatever society? No, I don't think so. But that tar is a substance that's always there, always there.
So the way in which we respond to the term in our community, in the African American community, and the negativity associated with it, has it become so because we've subscribed to the notion that somehow this term defines us? Are we giving too much power over to it? Are we embracing it in a way that we shouldn't? And let's say we decided that we were going to neutralize it, such as the N-word, because part of that email response we received from the title of the exhibition, someone was very upset and contacted the Smith Center and asked how dare they stand behind this exhibition, because the tar baby really stands for the N-word. And so You know, how could they get behind such a term? And so this person was African American. And so do we respond to this term from within our community because we've given too much power over to it?
It's an old expression. It's not what you're called, but what you answer to. But when I had read the email and I heard that N-word, it was like it's someone who doesn't know the history of Tar Baby. And if so, they would understand, just like the controversy when some senator or congressman referenced President Obama and Tar Baby. I don't know his whole story, but if it goes back again to the original story, it's relevant. If he's referencing color, it's not. But it is like us either having ownership or not having ownership of a word. And so I knew that the word itself would offend people, but only enough to maybe respond in a way, come look at and you'll understand. I just wanted to get your attention. It's like yelling sex, everybody, and then let's talk about it. But we may not be talking about what you hope we were talking about. But now that I've gotten your attention, and that's kind of what the whole Tar Baby in your face is all about. I've gotten your attention now. Let's talk about it.
Well, part of what you've done with those terms, those things that are associated with the word, you have included in this piece.
Right.
And how did you come about creating this?
I think there's you can see it's a huge body of work. There's a lot of stuff going on, but this particular piece happened very quickly. It was just I was in my studio working on a series of the body of work, and I decided to just Google Tar Baby and see what definitions came up, and it was ramblings of all kinds. They came from all over the place. So I simply created the image and then wrote what I read around the image. And so take it, read, let whatever stand out that you want to stand out. What I had thought about doing but chose not to is I thought it was brilliant about Basquiat's doing this, but he said if you ever want to get someone's attention, cross out the word because it will be the center point of whatever you're trying to say. So then it becomes my story though. If I said, okay, I want people to focus on this word, so I'm going to cross that word out. It's like, no, I want you to focus on whatever words or words you choose to, so it becomes your story. I want to address something. I'm listening to what you're describing and how you're breaking it down. If you understand where I'm coming from, you'll understand that I really believe this body of work is brilliant. But no, hear me out. But I take no claim to it. When I hear how you break it down and all the different layers, as you were even talking about the tar, because you were talking about the tar and how it was used for a ship, I'm like, oh my God, that's brilliant. And I'm thinking like God. Meaning God Almighty. It's like when this was revealed to me and it came through me, I can honestly say at times I didn't get it. At times I didn't understand what I was saying and what I was trying to say. But with the essay and looking at it and everything, it was the aha moments over and over again. I'm like, I'm getting this. This is making more sense. And as an artist, sometimes it's not about our story. It's like once I create a piece of work, it's like having an artist talk. Once you create a piece of work, you already said what you needed to say as a visual artist. Now it becomes the viewer. And when the viewer looks at this piece, the viewer can look at one of these pieces and say, when I look at this, I see da 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 da. And I would never say you're wrong. I've had conversations with artists that say, no, you're wrong. Because my intent was like, you know what, you can't be wrong because you're doing it, your response is based on your life, your experiences, your education. And so therefore, if this is what you get from the piece, that's what you get from it. And so when I look at this, I'm learning all the time what is coming through me in the stories that I'm telling, And then and the personal piece, that personal piece, my Tar Baby. Are we getting to that? Okay, we'll get to that.
So we're not going to end today without talking about our own Tar Babies, because as we've had dialogues around this body of work, and we all agree, which Horace addresses in the essay that. And I'll read from that. He said, we all of us have Tar Babies. And so, what are your Tar Babies?
I think for me, education is definitely one. I think for me, issues around gender, sexuality, race, socioeconomic status are really important for me. And will be ways in which I for better or for worse, to death do you part, in and out of them. I think for me, one of them is really thinking about what is the space of a public intellectual who is a person of color in the 21st century America. And whether we think about America as being a place, a geographic location, or whether it is an ideal that is international, transnational, universal, and what that means, and what that means for how I define my work, and what that means for what paths I choose.
And you, Charly? Well, Charly's Star Baby is really made public. His piece is here. So why don't you tell us about my Star Baby?
You know, initially when that piece was revealed to me, I did everything I could to not put it in the show, because as I began to look at it, I was really embarrassed by it, because of what it was saying to me, because it reminds me very much like the snake in the Garden of Eden. And so I'm looking at me and saying, am I a snake in the Garden of Eden? And what am I saying about myself? But it had everything to do with really trying to maneuver relationships, trying to settle down, trying to be in a committed relationship, and how challenging it had been to me, or for me. And so it was like, what is beautiful women is my tar baby, you know, and they're all over the place. And so it's like, but it was like really honestly, like, if I put this out there, what am I exposing myself to? And so, but it was all of that. It was really kind of like, you know, let's talk about it. Let's honestly say, am I the snake? Someone said to me at the first time they opened the show, well, he said, you understand that the apple represented knowledge. So actually all you're doing is representing, or you're presenting knowledge to someone. I'm like, I would love to take that. But I'm like, no, when I looked at it, and trust me, when I say to you, when I created this piece, for some reason other than I allowed it to kind of happen creatively, I didn't see myself as a snake until I was completed with the piece. And when I saw it, I'm like, am I saying that I'm a snake? That's really an uncomfortable and bold statement. But at the same time, it was an honest statement. And so I'm frankly proud of it, because I'm learning to be vulnerable as an artist, because I know in order to reach a certain level creatively, I have to be willing to show me. And this is, the body of work is somewhat an attempts at time to show me.
Well, I'll reveal a little bit of my tar baby. Mine is being an African American woman in the arts industry, being one of a handful who is in the fine art industry, and in an industry that is still very segregated, unregulated. People operate based primarily by their own moral compass, which, depending on your perspective, can be very good or not. And the struggle I have with trying to integrate it, I'm not one that just sits back and says, well, it's segregated and it shall be that way. I work towards integrating it, which is very challenging. So I think that is my tar baby, in trying to maintain and sustain my business and my integrity in this industry. And there are very few African American women who are gallerists. And so the pool of those that I can call upon is very, very small. And so that tends to be my angst and my joy at the same time. So I'd like to open the floor up, and thank you all again. But before we depart, I wanted to open the floor up to ask if you have any questions.
Oh, wow, good. I have a question. I'd like to know which is your favorite. I know probably asking an artist about, what's their favorite pieces, like asking a parent who's your favorite child, even though every parent has one. So can you just share with us which is your favorite?
You know, funny that you say that, turning it a little bit. I was my mother's favorite child. and I knew, we all knew this. But my mom would always say, no, I love all y'all equally. But everybody would say, there's 6 of us all together. And, but she was also my hero. You know, my mom passed 3 years ago, and when it did, it turned my life upside down for a year or so. I had to make that transition. But I understand when it's like horror, because pieces are favorites for different reasons. And I think right now, was it Picasso who said the next one is my favorite piece? But there's a piece as you're heading out called The Conversation. And it's the larger one of Brer Rabbit and Tar Baby. And I really liked how it flowed. It came out really easily. And I love those moments when something just makes sense and it comes with no effort. And so I like that because it's leading me to the next thing, which will lead me to the next thing. So I'm really happy with that piece. That's one of my favorites.
Yeah, number one, just looking at the show aesthetically, your design sense in this fine art medium is really, the composition, you know, is consistently outstanding. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Horace, I'm always looking for what's next. So the historical piece is really good, but I'm also trying to figure out what is this American-ness. Also, I'm really struggling with that. But Horace, you mentioned in the first paragraph of your essay that this is a meditation on forgiveness. And that, for me, is like the notion of reconciliation, personal, and then between and amongst the human family, with all of the stuff that in history has been challenging: war, theories of war, interpersonal relations, the whole thing. What did you mean by that in the context of this?
I think that Charly's work is truly a work in progress. And by work in progress, I mean it's something that he's committed to continually exploring in his own practice, that it's not finished. And also the sense that every single day when we step out into the world, however we define that world, I truly believe that we both take part of the knowledge that we have of history with us into that world so that we know how to function. We could call it muscle memory. We could call it kind of learned experience. We could call it an acculturation. And we also have to put a chunk of that history in our purse, in our bill folder, in our back drawer when we pick out our socks and close it, so that we can negotiate in the world in good faith. And for me, every single image in this series that you see here tonight and that's in the catalog are Charly's moments of good faith. Charly's showing us these images of literary, historical, cultural figures that are really asking us to look at ourselves and ask us, what are our own tar babies? How have we gossiped, talked about these folk as we saw them in the gossip rags or on TV? And then what are the ways that we have to forgive them and forgive ourselves? Part of forgiving is forgetting. In kind of the Christian tradition that I came out for, you forgive someone and then you have to forget that knowledge, right? And for me, that was always difficult. What does it mean to forget? What does it mean to actively not remember? And I think that through these works, we're asked to forgive the society that martyred some of these figures. And by forgiving society, we have to forgive ourselves in order to constantly, on a daily basis, make a good faith effort to be a good citizen of the world. But the Germans call it the Gesamtkunstwerk, the perfect work of art that encapsulates all the senses that is yet to come, that we will never achieve, but we can always strive towards it.
Another question?
I'm trying to get to my question. It's more a comment. I think the question will come as I'm doing. I was kind of struck by by the profundity of the exhibition in the manipulation of language and image of Tar Baby, and how these images are dialoguing with each other and with us. And yet there were some things that were, it made me kind of think about the iconography and the imaging of Tar Baby, and some notions of our own majesty, the fact that a tale that is presumed to be a children's tale that was then turned into a trivialized, very racialized, stereotypical tale is in fact a deeply profound kind of maxim that discusses a fundamental kind of philosophical existential part of life, and the way African cosmology and theology conveyed that sense of the philosophical question through a very elemental and essentialized drama. And within this notion of the Tar Baby, and it kind of comes out with the graphic imaging of the language and the physical body. There's a lot of physicality in your work, I think, and the physicality of the Tar Baby being this silent creature. And part of the story is Reubens trying to engage, and you came in saying, I want to engage in everyone in a dialogue about our history and our experience, and it's the very engagement that is entangling. And it's also our very silence that is causing this frustration. When we talked about when you spoke so eloquently about the forgetting, on the one hand we need to forgive and forget, on the other hand we need to remember, because there's a whole generation that is ignorant of both the philosophical basis of the exhibition and of these heroic images, these heroic characters in our history, who were all pretty much emblems of resistance. So again, this brilliant kind of relationship of the tar and the trying to engage, and at the same time as you pull away and resist. It's all kind of in this dynamic interplay in your work. So I was quite kind of fascinated by that, the layering.
Yeah, that was beautifully stated, and I'm a child of a musician. And so I grew up with this wonderful music in my home and original works of art. And so Horace actually touches upon this, and I love, he draws this analogy about the rhythm and the pulse in the pieces. And some beat loudly, and for me, and some beat softly. Like the sepia tone approach you took to Nina and Josephine Baker versus the pulse that's in the Paul Robeson piece, are kind of indicative in a way of their personalities and their presence in our history. So I really, really love that. And you get a different feeling when you stand before each piece. Again, how we interact and perceive the work is based on our own histories, our own private histories, and our genetic, our atavistic memory, those innate properties and things that exist within us that are passed down, just like the oral tradition of storytelling in Africa. So the body of work is profound on many levels and for many reasons, and I think we define that individually, we define it collectively, and then you also help to define it for us.
I'd like to say something. I came here, I think, more to see how, I use a crass term, mechanically, you would explain your way out of what seemed to be enraging subject matter. And I come through the show, I know Brooke and I know the group, and I'm part of a very white sculpture group. And we're gonna have a show up next door to where the African American Museum is gonna be in Brentwood. And I found the curator at Howard University who had written an essay for one of my catalogs and said, let's see if we can just open this up and blink. I'm tired of the Chevy chaseness of our group, and everybody is, they think they're going a great distance if they have to cross Wisconsin Avenue. Come on, what can we do? So I came here, I think, really looking for I wanted to see what you would do inside of your paper bag and how you would punch your way out. And I have to say, I'm really, really touched by elegant and eloquent presentation by all three of you. And I just wanted to share that. It's been a special night.
Thank you.
And one thing, though, for you that I pass along that comes out of the yogic tradition, which is forgiveness and compassion, followed by asanga, which is a Sanskrit term for non-attachment. Don't forget, just let go. Thank you.
I think this will be our last question.
This is just a comment. I wanted to thank the three of you for sharing about your tar baby. I think I came here tonight wondering who is tar baby, wanting to kind of be able to look around and be able to answer that question. And to me, I thought, okay, tar baby is the albatross around, if you've read The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, it's the albatross that's hanging around his neck and weighing him down. But it's not. I mean, tar baby is not what's hiding in our closet. It's not the boogeyman. It's almost what lives on the horizon of something new and exciting, especially from what you both shared. It's linked to your vocation. It's linked to relationships, breakthroughs, and all of those, or strivings to get to a new place. And that's how I feel like it accompanies a lot of these pieces, or, it's with things that we take pleasure in, or, we find ourselves in office. Like, those are things to celebrate. They're also difficult, and they're things that we wrestle with. But I think the very fact that you've chosen people who are artists and who are accomplished just makes me still probably not be able to answer that question of who the tar baby is, but for sure I know tar baby is not necessarily a negative figure. It's something that challenges us, doesn't necessarily need a negative connotation.
So I would like to end the discussion by asking each one of you to invite your friends and families to come here and not be put off by the title, but to really come to experience it as you all have. Now you have to be the narrator, you have to take them through so they understand that, we're not talking about the individual, but, well, you put it into context for them. And thank you all for coming here tonight.